The calm before the storm. The late afternoon sun shimmered over the sprawling cityscape, its rays glancing off high-rise buildings and glinting on the windshields of countless cars weaving through traffic. For Marcus Thompson, it was just another day ending like so many before it. Long hours in courtrooms, reviewing case files, and trying to weigh the scales of justice in a system he had sworn to serve. His mind buzzed with thoughts of his last trial, an exhausting, emotionally taxing domestic violence case that had ended in a conviction. He felt the familiar pang of satisfaction, mixed with a weariness that sank into his bones. As Marcus turned onto the quiet, tree-lined streets of his affluent neighborhood, the heaviness began to lift. Home was his sanctuary, a refuge he'd built over decades of tireless work and sacrifice. Tonight, his son David would be home from college for the weekend. They had planned a simple dinner together, a much-needed break to reconnect and share stories. For Marcus, these small moments with his son were precious. They reminded him of the reasons he pushed so hard and refused to let life's obstacles break him. He glanced at the dashboard clock. 6:43 p.m. His sleek black Audi, a hard-earned reward he'd treated himself to a few weeks prior, purred quietly as he navigated the last turn toward his street. As Marcus approached a stop sign, he noticed a patrol car parked just a few yards away. The officer inside seemed to glance in his direction, her gaze lingering for just a beat too long. He thought nothing of it, his mind already drifting to thoughts of dinner and catching up on David's latest escapades. The sirens came first, sharp, urgent, and unmistakable. Marcus's heart stuttered in his chest as the blaring noise shattered the calm. The patrol car had moved into his lane, the red and blue lights flashing with an intensity that felt accusatory. For a fleeting moment, he considered driving forward. This had to be a mistake, but instincts honed from years of understanding how the world worked stopped him. He pulled over, exhaling slowly as he gripped the steering wheel. "Stay calm." The words echoed in his mind, as familiar as a prayer. The officer, a young woman with short, steely blonde hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached his car. Her silhouette against the backdrop of the setting sun was sharp and imposing. Marcus rolled down his window, his every movement deliberate, his face carefully neutral. "License and registration." The officer barked, her voice clipped, no hint of politeness or courtesy. Marcus froze for half a second, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. There was no greeting, no explanation, just an immediate command. He caught her expression, cold, almost calculated, her narrowed eyes searching his face, as though she expected to see something incriminating there. He reached slowly for his wallet, pulling out his license and offering it to her. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was steady, practiced, polished through years of managing conflict in courtrooms. "Step out of the vehicle." The words hit him harder than he anticipated. Marcus blinked, the absurdity of the situation sinking in. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone careful. He knew better than to let frustration seep into his voice. The officer's hand hovered near her holster. "Step out of the car," she repeated, louder this time, her stance rigid, her voice sharp with something Marcus couldn't name. Suspicion, distrust, or something deeper. It didn't matter what it was. He recognized it. The same poison that had seeped into moments like these for far too long. Marcus's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. A quiet tension gathered in his chest, coiling tight like a spring. He wanted to argue, to demand a reason, to assert his identity. But he knew how quickly that could escalate. His son's face flashed in his mind, and the lessons he taught David echoed back to him. "Stay calm. Stay dignified." The weight of those words pressed down on him. He took a deep breath, his jaw tight, and slowly opened the door. The officer stepped back, hand still hovering over her weapon, as Marcus emerged from the car. The evening air felt cool against his skin, but the heat of humiliation was hotter, heavier than the sun dipping below the skyline. "Hands on the hood," the officer commanded, her voice flat, unyielding. Marcus turned to face her, disbelief flickering across his face. "Officer, there's been some mistake. I'm Judge Marcus Thompson. This is my vehicle. I live just a block away." The title, Judge, should have been enough. It carried weight, respect. But as he spoke the words, he saw no change in her expression. If anything, her eyes hardened, her mouth setting into a firmer line. "I didn't ask for your credentials," she shot back, hands on the hood. For a moment, Marcus stood frozen in place, his mind racing through the options. Defiance would serve no purpose here. The years of arguments and rulings he'd made, the words he used to resolve conflicts in court, felt useless now. There were no juries here, no motions or appeals, just a street, an officer, and a moment that threatened to shatter everything he'd worked for. Reluctantly, Marcus turned and placed his palms on the cool metal of his Audi. The world narrowed to the distant hum of traffic, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the sound of his own controlled breathing. Behind him, he heard the officer speaking into her radio, her voice low and hurried. His mind swirled with thoughts. What did she see when she looked at me? Was it my suit? My car? My skin? Years of effort to prove himself, to show the world that he was more than the assumptions they made about him, felt like they were unraveling in a single surreal moment. He thought of David, of the lectures he'd given his son about encounters like these. He always spoke with the confidence of someone who had risen above it. Now, as his own dignity was stripped away, those words felt hollow. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, the sound barely audible. Stay calm for what? A voice inside him growled. The righteous anger bubbled beneath his practiced calm, but Marcus shoved it down. The officer finished her radio call and stepped closer. Her shadow fell across him, a stark contrast to the evening light. "We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area," she said curtly. "This car matches the description." Marcus turned his head just enough to look at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Run the plates," he said, his voice cool but tinged with controlled frustration. "You'll see this vehicle belongs to me." The officer's jaw tightened. She didn't move toward her computer, didn't check the plates as he'd suggested. Instead, she lingered there, like she was daring him to give her a reason to escalate the situation further. For Marcus, the moment stretched painfully long. He felt the weight of unseen eyes. The neighbors peeking from behind their curtains, the cars slowing to gawk at the scene. Their silent judgment settled over him like a suffocating blanket. What did they see? A man, a judge, or just a suspect? Lines drawn in silence. Marcus Thompson stood by his car, his palms still pressed against the cold, polished hood, his body as still as the air around him. The quiet of the neighborhood had shifted. It was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, weighed down by invisible judgment, and the unspoken words hiding behind drawn curtains. In the distance, a faint breeze rustled through the trees, but even nature seemed to hold its breath. The officer, whose nameplate read R. Carson, circled him with slow, deliberate steps, her boots crunching on the gravel. Her scrutiny was a spotlight, shining too brightly on every detail of him. His neatly tailored suit, the glint of his wristwatch, the quiet power of a man who knew he'd earned his place in the world. But none of that mattered to her. In her eyes, all of it was secondary to the color of his skin. "You got a problem following instructions, sir," Officer Carson finally said, her voice low and even, but laced with authority. She loomed just behind him, close enough that Marcus could hear her breathing. Marcus swallowed the urge to respond immediately. A measured pause, he'd learned, was often his greatest weapon. He lifted his head, though his hands remained flat on the hood. "No problem, Officer Carson. I'm simply wondering why you haven't run my plates yet. I've already told you who I am, and I'm sure you have the tools to verify that." There was a flicker in her expression, just a flicker, gone as quickly as it came, but Marcus caught it. Doubt. For a fraction of a second, her certainty had cracked. She wasn't used to people like him standing tall under pressure, wasn't used to their voices remaining so calm when faced with the crushing weight of suspicion. "Don't tell me how to do my job," Carson snapped, though her voice wavered. She moved back toward her squad car, but her hand still hovered near her holstered weapon, as if Marcus might suddenly morph into the very criminal she imagined. Marcus stayed exactly where he was, his breathing deep and deliberate. He thought of his father, of the stories he used to tell about growing up in a different time, a harsher time, where men like him didn't dare talk back, didn't dare meet anyone's eyes. Marcus had grown up with the faint whispers of those old fears, warnings disguised as lessons passed down through generations. Yet Marcus had also been taught pride. Pride in his work, his education, his ability to rise above every obstacle life had thrown at him. And now, here he was, a man of stature, reduced to silence in his own neighborhood. The minutes dragged on. The patrol car's radio crackled softly as Officer Carson called in his license plate, her voice clipped and tight. Marcus thought of David, his son, his pride. The boy had always been curious, asking endless questions about the world around him, especially as he grew older and began to see its cracks. Marcus had worked tirelessly to give David every advantage, every lesson to protect him. But how do you explain moments like this? How do you tell your son to stay calm when calm feels like surrender? The sound of footsteps jarred him from his thoughts. Marcus turned his head slightly and saw two other officers approaching from down the street. One older, his salt and pepper hair betraying years on the force, the other younger and eager-looking, his badge still gleaming as if it had been polished that morning. Officer Carson must have called for backup. "Judge Thompson," the older officer said as he approached, his voice far more measured than Carson's. His eyes scanned Marcus briefly before settling on the young officer. "Carson, what's going on here?" Carson stiffened slightly, as though she didn't appreciate being questioned. "Suspicious vehicle, sir. Matches a reported stolen car. I was verifying identification." The older officer tilted his head, a slight frown creasing his features. "You ran his plates." Carson hesitated. Marcus saw it, felt it. "Not yet, sir," she finally admitted. The silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, his anger burning hotter. Not yet. Of course not. She hadn't needed verification to treat him like this. Her assumptions had been enough. "Run the plates," the older officer ordered, his tone low, but firm. Carson stiffened but moved quickly back to her squad car. Marcus allowed himself a breath, his fingers flexing slightly against the hood of his car. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was something close. The older officer stepped closer, his posture far less threatening. "Judge Thompson, I apologize for any misunderstanding here," he said quietly. "You know how it is. Officers have to be cautious these days." Marcus turned to look at him, disbelief flickering in his dark eyes. "How it is," he repeated softly, though there was no mistaking the edge in his voice. He pushed off the hood, straightening his posture, and met the officer's gaze squarely. "Is that the excuse we're using now?" "How it is." The officer faltered. "I meant no disrespect, sir." "No," Marcus said, his voice sharp enough to make the younger officer flinch. "You don't mean disrespect. You just allow it to happen. You stand here and watch it unfold. And what happens if I didn't respond the way she wanted me to? If I didn't stay calm? What happens then?" The older officer opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. Marcus didn't need an answer. He already knew. They all knew. The squad car's radio crackled again, and Carson's voice cut through the silence. "The plates are clean. Vehicle registered to a Marcus Thompson." Her tone had changed, almost subdued, but Marcus felt no satisfaction. Her words did not erase the last 20 minutes of humiliation. The older officer sighed heavily. "We're sorry for the inconvenience, Judge, truly." Marcus turned slowly, his gaze cutting through the distance between him and Carson. She stood by her car, her shoulders squared, Though her expression had shifted, there was something else there now. Embarrassment, perhaps, but not apology. Not understanding. An inconvenience, Marcus repeated, as though tasting the word on his tongue. He turned back to the older officer, his gaze unwavering. "I want your captain here. Now." The older man hesitated. "Judge." "Now." Marcus snapped. He could feel his pulse racing, his calm exterior starting to fray. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about David. It was about every man who had been stopped on a quiet street for no other reason than existing. Officer Carson shifted uneasily but said nothing. She knew. She knew she'd been wrong. The older officer pulled out his radio reluctantly, calling in the request for their captain. Marcus didn't move. He stood tall, arms crossed, his car behind him like a monument to everything he'd built for himself. His neighbors were watching. He could feel their eyes burning through the curtains. Maybe some of them would whisper tonight about the judge who got pulled over in his own neighborhood. Others might not whisper at all. They might nod quietly to themselves, thinking, of course he did. But Marcus didn't care. He would not let this moment pass quietly into memory. Not this time. A battle beyond words. The quiet hum of anticipation filled the neighborhood like a fog. The sun had fully dipped beneath the horizon now, leaving behind streaks of orange and purple fading into the darkness. Streetlights flickered to life one by one, their harsh glow casting shadows that seemed to stretch too far, distorting the reality of the moment. Judge Marcus Thompson stood tall next to his car, his jaw set, his eyes cold and unyielding. The air around him seemed heavier now as the faint sound of another car approached, its engine rumbling low and deliberate. A dark SUV rolled up, its tires crunching softly against the pavement before coming to a slow stop. The door opened, and Captain James Williams stepped out. Marcus recognized him immediately. Williams had been on the force for nearly 20 years, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose very presence seemed to fill the space around him. His face was lined with age and stress, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed. The captain's eyes met Marcus's as he approached, a flicker of recognition breaking through his stoic expression. He extended a hand stiffly. "Judge Thompson," he said, his voice low and measured, carrying just enough weight to sound authoritative without being confrontational. Marcus didn't take the hand. He simply stared back, the anger simmering quietly beneath his otherwise calm exterior. "Captain Williams," he replied, his voice clipped. Williams withdrew his hand and glanced at Officer Carson, who was still standing near her patrol car, her posture tense, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. "What happened here?" he asked her, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Possible stolen vehicle match," Carson muttered, her voice quieter now. "I was following procedure." "Following procedure?" Marcus echoed, stepping forward, his presence commanding enough that even Williams seemed to pause. "Let's clarify that for a moment, shall we? Your officer didn't run my plates for nearly 15 minutes. I complied with her every command. I gave her my identification. I told her who I was. And yet, I was treated as though I was dangerous, as though the mere act of sitting in my own car on my own street was a crime." Williams turned back to Carson, his expression shifting. "Is this true?" Carson's jaw tightened, her eyes darting between Williams and Marcus. "Don't answer that," Marcus interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm not interested in excuses. I'm interested in accountability." A stillness settled over the group. The younger officer who had arrived earlier took a step back, clearly uncomfortable as the weight of the moment bore down on them all. Marcus could feel the unspoken words in the air, thick and stifling. Why couldn't you let it go? Why couldn't you just move on? But Marcus couldn't. Not this time. "I've spent my life fighting for justice, Captain," Marcus said, his voice low but fierce, each word deliberate. "And I know injustice when I see it. Your officer didn't stop me because my car looked suspicious. She stopped me because I looked suspicious. Because a black man in a nice car doesn't belong here, does he? Williams exhaled heavily, his shoulders sagging slightly. Judge Thompson, I can assure you we don't condone racial profiling. Then how do you explain this? Marcus's voice rose slightly, the cracks in his calm beginning to show. Do you think she would have pulled over one of my neighbors for driving the same car? Would she have kept her hand on her gun if I looked different? If my skin were different? Carson shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking down to the pavement. Her silence was louder than any defense she could have offered. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, Marcus continued, his tone colder now. Not to me. Not to men like me. It's happened before, and it will keep happening unless someone puts an end to it. I know how this works, Captain. I know the conversations that happen behind closed doors. Officers like Carson get a slap on the wrist, maybe some training, and then we all pretend things will be different. The silence deepened, and Marcus could feel the neighbors watching more intently now. Some had come out onto their porches, small clusters of figures silhouetted against porch lights. This was no longer just a traffic stop. It was a spectacle, a reckoning. Captain Williams finally turned to Carson, his voice firm. Officer Carson, return to the precinct and file a full incident report. I'll handle it from here. Carson's eyes widened slightly. Captain, that's an order, Williams said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Carson stared at him for a moment longer before snapping a salute, her face pale and tight. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her squad car, her boots echoing loudly in the heavy silence. The younger officer followed her lead, leaving only Marcus, Williams, and the quiet murmurs of the neighborhood behind. Marcus exhaled slowly, though his anger still burned brightly. Williams turned to him, his expression equal parts regret and discomfort. Judge Thompson, I'll make sure this is addressed. That's not enough, Marcus replied sharply. Addressed? You're talking about paperwork, about investigations that go nowhere. I don't want apologies, Captain. I want change. I want to know that the next black man driving down this street won't be humiliated the way I was tonight. Williams's shoulders straightened, and for the first time, Marcus saw something flicker in his gaze, something like understanding, or maybe guilt. What do you suggest? He asked quietly. Marcus studied him for a long moment before answering. A meeting. Public. In this neighborhood. I want you and your officers there. I want you to look the people in this community in the eye and answer for what happened tonight. No hiding behind reports. No excuses. Williams hesitated, clearly weighing his options. He looked at Marcus, and in that moment, Marcus knew the captain was picturing the news headlines, the scrutiny, the fallout. Finally, Williams nodded slowly. I'll arrange it. I'll make it happen. You'd better, Marcus said, his voice still hard, but the fire behind it had tempered slightly. He turned back to his car, the tension in his body refusing to ease. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. As he slid back into the driver's seat, Marcus glanced up at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his reflection. He looked tired, older than he remembered, but there was something else there, too. A determination so sharp it could have cut glass. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about David. It was about every young black man who would sit in this same seat, on this same street, and wonder if this moment would end in handcuffs, or worse. Marcus pulled away slowly, the engine's quiet hum filling the silence where Carson's commands had once echoed. Change was coming. He would see to that. Ripples in the water. The meeting was set. A small notice went out 2 days after the incident. Community Forum on Policing Practices, hosted by Judge Marcus Thompson and Captain James Williams. It was meant to be neutral, stripped of tension, but everyone in the neighborhood knew better. The story had spread like wildfire. It started in whispers on porches and phone calls between friends, but soon, the story was everywhere, passed through grocery lines, church pews, and barbershops. Did you hear what happened to the judge? Right there in his own neighborhood. What's the world coming to? The town's newspaper had picked it up too. The headline was understated, but the photo said everything. A picture of Marcus standing beside his Audi, his body silhouetted against flashing police lights, appeared just below the masthead. Even without context, the image told a truth that words could only cheapen. For Marcus, the days leading up to the forum were heavy. Every interaction reminded him of how precarious his standing truly was. When Marcus walked into his office at the courthouse 2 days after the incident, his secretary Sharon gave him a look, her eyes wide with concern. She'd been with him for nearly a decade and knew him better than most. "Judge Thompson, I've been taking calls all morning." Marcus stopped, his hand lingering on the doorknob. "About the forum?" She nodded. "Some are supportive. Others aren't." "Of course," he muttered, more to himself than her. He had expected pushback, the kind that came wrapped in phrases like, "Why make this public?" or "Don't stir the pot." But he also knew that silence was no longer an option, not for him, not for anyone. He entered his office, the towering stacks of legal briefs and motions waiting for his review. Yet today, the sight of them left him cold. For the first time in his career, the law felt powerless to him. It couldn't erase what had happened. It couldn't fix what was broken. The night of the forum. The local community center was packed to the point of bursting. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, though every seat was already filled, and a crowd spilled out toward the back of the room, standing shoulder to shoulder. The murmurs of conversation created a low hum, filled with nervous energy. Reporters lined the back wall with cameras and notebooks in hand, ready to seize every word, every expression. Marcus stood at the front of the room, flanked by a long table. Beside him sat Captain Williams, who looked more uncomfortable than Marcus had ever seen him. The rest of the table was occupied by officers, community leaders, and clergy members, faces carefully chosen to project balance, as if fairness could be manufactured. Marcus scanned the crowd, his gaze briefly catching a familiar face. David stood near the back of the room, his arms crossed, his expression taut. His son had insisted on being there. "You need me to see this," David had said earlier that evening, his voice quiet but firm. And he was right. Marcus stepped up to the podium, gripping its edges as the murmurs began to die down. The microphone crackled slightly as he leaned in. He could feel every eye in the room on him. Some were watching with expectation, others with skepticism. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet edge. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. We are here because something happened, a moment that exposed what many of us already know to be true." The room was silent now, save for the faint hum of a heater somewhere in the back. "I was pulled over in my own neighborhood," Marcus continued, his tone measured but unflinching. "I complied. I was calm. I was deliberate. And still, I was treated as though I had no right to be there." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. What happened to me was not unique. It happens every day, to people who don't have a title or a platform to stand on. I was lucky, if you can call it that, because I walked away from it with nothing more than my pride bruised. But how many others don't? How many others have been silenced because they knew there was no point in speaking up? Marcus looked out at the faces staring back at him. Mothers, fathers, teenagers, grandparents, each of them carried a silent story. A run-in at a traffic stop, a questioning look in a store, an unwelcome confrontation for simply existing. "I've spent my life fighting for justice," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger now. "Not just for myself, but for every person who has been told, time and time again, that they are less than what they are. And I will not stop." There was no applause, no cheers, just the heavy stillness of a room where truth had been laid bare. Marcus stepped back and turned to Captain Williams, gesturing for him to speak. Williams rose stiffly, his discomfort clear. He tugged at his collar before addressing the crowd. "Thank you, Judge Thompson," he said, though the words sounded forced. "We recognize that what happened was unacceptable. Officer Carson's actions are under review, and additional training will be implemented across the department. Training. Marcus's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. The word hung in the air like an insult. Training had become the go-to salve for wounds that ran much deeper than policy. Questions, Williams asked, turning to the crowd. Hands shot up like arrows. A woman in the front row stood. She looked to be in her early 50s, her short silver hair framing a face lined with years of worry. My son, she began, her voice shaking, was stopped 3 times last month walking home from work. 3 times. He's 19. What kind of training is going to stop that from happening? Williams shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, Marcus cut him off. Training won't stop it. Accountability will. The woman turned her gaze to Marcus, gratitude flickering briefly in her eyes. Another hand shot up, this time belonging to a young man. How are we supposed to trust you? He asked, his voice sharp with frustration. How do we know you're not just gonna forget about this in a month? Williams opened his mouth, but Marcus spoke first. You don't trust words. You trust actions. This isn't over tonight. This is only the beginning. Hold us accountable. Hold me accountable. I will not let this moment pass quietly. The young man nodded, though his expression remained hardened. After the forum. As the crowd began to thin out, Marcus made his way toward David, who still lingered near the back of the room. His son looked at him, his expression conflicted. That was powerful, David said finally. Thank you, Marcus replied softly. But is it enough? David's voice broke slightly as he asked the question, and Marcus felt his heart tighten. No, Marcus admitted, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. It's not. But it's a start, and sometimes that's all we have. David nodded, though his gaze lingered on the officers packing up their notes at the front of the room. Marcus followed his son's line of sight and knew what he was thinking. That change would be slow. That some of these men and women still didn't understand the depth of what had been exposed tonight. But Marcus had made them look. He had forced them to see. And that was something. As father and son walked out into the cold night air, Marcus glanced at the stars overhead. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But he wasn't walking away. The breaking point. Marcus awoke before sunrise, his body still heavy with exhaustion. He had spent most of the night replaying the forum in his mind. The faces in the crowd, the questions, the doubt lingering in their eyes. For all the progress he thought he had made, the weight of the task ahead seemed almost insurmountable. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring into the dim light filtering through his window. Is it enough? David's voice echoed in his head. It wasn't. Marcus knew it wasn't. Words spoken at a forum could stir emotions, but they didn't change systems. Systems fought back. They hid behind policies, bureaucracy, and empty promises. And if Marcus had learned one thing during his years in the courtroom, it was that real change required more than public outrage. It required pressure. Relentless, unyielding pressure. As Marcus sipped his morning coffee, his phone buzzed. Sharon's name appeared on the screen. He frowned. She never called this early. Sharon, he answered, his voice gruff with sleep. Judge Thompson, Sharon said, her voice quick and anxious. You need to see the morning news. It's everywhere. What is? Marcus asked sharply, sitting up straighter. They're talking about Officer Carson. Someone leaked the bodycam footage. Marcus's heart froze mid-beat. Send it to me. Moments later, a link appeared in his inbox. Marcus clicked on it, the video loading in seconds. The screen flickered to life with shaky footage from Officer Carson's bodycam. There he was, himself, stepping out of his Audi, his movements slow and deliberate. The audio crackled. Step out of the car. Officer, there's been some mistake. I'm Judge Marcus Thompson. The video didn't lie. It didn't cut out the way her hand hovered near her weapon, the way her voice sharpened unnecessarily, or the long, unnecessary delay before she finally called in his plates. But worse, far worse, was the silence after his identification. Her refusal to acknowledge him, to accept his word, was a damning indictment in itself. Marcus's jaw tightened as he listened to his own voice, calm and measured despite the humiliation. He watched as the moments stretched on, unbearable in their clarity. His stomach churned. This was the truth he had lived, raw and undeniable. But now the world could see it, too. The fallout. By mid-morning, the footage had gone viral. News stations broadcast it on repeat, while headlines screamed across every platform. Prominent black judge detained without cause. Bodycam footage released. The footage was dissected from every angle, on TV panels, radio debates, and social media threads. Some praised Marcus's composure, holding him up as an example of how to handle these situations. Others saw it as proof of a broken system, where titles and respectability offered no protection from bias. But not everyone viewed it the same way. The backlash was swift and vicious. Anonymous accounts online began spreading rumors. Why didn't he just comply sooner? He thinks he's special because he's a judge. Not everything is about race. And then there were the threats. By noon, Marcus's courthouse office was buzzing with calls, some supportive, others filled with venom. Sharon filtered out the worst of them, but the ugly ones still found their way through. Marcus sat at his desk, staring at his phone, where yet another anonymous voicemail played. "You're a disgrace. You're the problem with this country. If you don't shut up, we'll shut you up." He deleted it and leaned back, exhaling heavily. He had always understood that taking the stand came with a price, but he had underestimated how steep that price would be. A knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." The door opened, and David stepped in, holding his phone. His face was tight with anger. "Dad," he said, voice low, "you've seen it, haven't you? The comments, the news, everything." "I have," Marcus replied quietly, folding his hands on the desk. David shook his head, pacing the room. "They're twisting it. They're turning you into the villain. Why? Why can't they just see what's right in front of them?" "Because the truth makes people uncomfortable," Marcus said simply. "When you challenge the way things are, you threaten people's comfort. They'll do anything to defend that." David stopped, his fists clenching. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Marcus's gaze hardened. "We fight harder." The plan. That evening, Marcus met with a small group of trusted allies in his living room. They were community leaders, attorneys, activists, and clergy members. People who had dedicated their lives to fighting battles just like this one. "This footage is a gift," said Terrence Holt, an attorney and longtime friend. "It's damning. It forces them to confront the truth." "But they'll try to spin it," Marcus replied. "You know they will. They'll turn this into a debate about compliance or procedures. We need to control the narrative." "How?" asked Reverend Mitchell, a calm but forceful presence in the room. "We demand a formal investigation," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Not just into Officer Carson, but into the department's entire handling of racial profiling complaints. We need data, transparency, accountability." A murmur of agreement passed through the room. "And it doesn't stop there," Marcus continued. "We mobilize. We organize protests, not just performative marches, but sustained action. We get media attention. We apply pressure to city officials, and we make them listen." "Are you ready for that, Marcus?" Terrence asked. "The backlash is going to get worse before it gets better. They'll come after you, your family, your career." Marcus glanced at David, who sat silently in the corner, listening intently. His son's presence reminded him of the stakes. "I'm ready," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "Because if we don't do this now, then when?" The room fell silent, and then, one by one, they nodded. The plan was in motion. The breaking point. The following week, a peaceful protest filled the city square. People of all races and backgrounds marched side by side, holding signs that read, "Justice for all. Accountability now. End racial profiling." Marcus stood at the front of the crowd, megaphone in hand, his voice carrying across a square. "We are not here to divide. We are here to demand better. For our children, for ourselves, for this city. We are here because the system is broken, and we will not stop until it is fixed." Cheers erupted from the crowd. The energy was electric, but Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The real battle would come in courtrooms, in city council meetings, in policies rewritten to ensure that no one else had to endure what he had. As Marcus stepped down from the makeshift stage, David walked up to him. For the first time in days, his son's expression softened. "You really think this can change things?" David asked quietly. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "It has to," he said, "because we won't let it go." David nodded, and for a moment, Marcus saw hope in his eyes, a hope that things could change. The fight had begun, and Marcus knew there was no turning back. The road to justice. The city buzzed with unrest. It was no longer just whispers on street corners or murmurs behind closed doors. There was movement now, visible and undeniable. The protest had ignited a fire, a collective refusal to accept silence as the status quo. What began as a personal moment of humiliation for Marcus Thompson had grown into something larger than he ever anticipated. Over the following weeks, stories emerged. People who had remained quiet for years suddenly finding the courage to share their own experiences. They came forward in waves. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, each of their accounts forming a chorus of frustration and anger. News outlets aired interviews with residents of the community, many of whom revealed they, too, had been stopped unfairly or questioned without cause. Patterns became impossible to ignore, and the city's police department found itself at the center of scrutiny. Marcus stood in his living room late one evening, staring at his television as yet another panel of news pundits debated what had now become a national story. His face had become a symbol, something Marcus had never wanted, but something he could not ignore. Is this about one officer's mistake, or does it point to something systemic? One panelist asked. "Systemic," Marcus muttered under his breath. He turned off the television and sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. He hadn't asked to be a martyr. He hadn't set out to become a symbol. All he wanted was what was right. And yet, here he was, his face and name plastered across every screen. To some, he was a hero, someone who had refused to back down. To others, he was a villain, stirring the pot, dividing a community that didn't want to face the truth. And then there were the threats. They came in all forms: emails, anonymous phone calls, notes left in his mailbox. Sharon had begun screening his messages to protect him, but she couldn't shield him from everything. The worst one arrived on a Tuesday morning, a letter written in red ink that read, "Walk away, or you'll regret it." Marcus stared at the note, his hand trembling slightly as he held it. He had been threatened before, of course. It came with being a judge, delivering rulings that didn't always sit well with everyone. But this was different. This was personal. The knock on his door startled him. "Dad?" David's voice cut through the tension. Marcus quickly tucked the letter into his desk drawer before opening the door. David stood there, holding a laptop, his face serious. "You need to see this," David said, stepping inside. "What is it?" Marcus asked. David set the laptop on the table and opened a news article. The headline stopped Marcus cold. New investigation reveals decade of racial profiling complaints in city police department. The article detailed a leaked internal report showing that dozens, if not hundreds, of complaints had been filed against officers for racial bias over the past 10 years. Most of them had been dismissed without investigation. A pattern of negligence, cover-ups, and hollow promises was finally laid bare for all to see. Marcus read each word carefully, a mix of anger and vindication boiling within him. He looked up at his son. Where did this come from? An anonymous source leaked it to the press. David replied. "It's all over the internet now. Everyone's talking about it." Marcus leaned back, exhaling deeply. This was the crack in the wall they had needed, the moment when the truth became undeniable. The system could no longer hide its flaws behind bureaucracy and platitudes. The courtroom showdown. A week later, Marcus stood outside the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters, cameras flashing in his face. The city council had been forced to hold a public hearing, and the entire community was watching. People lined the sidewalks, holding signs that read, "Accountability is justice. We stand with Marcus. Enough is enough." Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The city council members sat elevated at their long wooden table, their faces carefully neutral. Captain Williams and several other high-ranking officers sat across from Marcus and his team, their stiff uniforms pressed and pristine. Officer Carson was absent, placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, but her absence only served as a reminder of the tension that still hung in the air. Marcus took his seat and prepared to deliver the most important testimony of his life. He had spent countless days in courtrooms, but this felt different. This was personal. When his turn came, Marcus rose and stepped to the microphone. He glanced at the council members before speaking, his voice calm and unwavering. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak today," Marcus began. "Let me start by saying that this is not about one officer. It is not about one incident. This is about a system that allows bias to thrive unchecked, a system that has betrayed the trust of the very people it claims to protect." He paused, letting the words settle. "I have served as a judge in this city for more than 15 years, he continued. "I have upheld the law, defended the innocent, and punished the guilty. But what happened to me proves that the law is not applied equally. I was not seen as a judge that night. I was not seen as a man who has spent his life defending justice. I was seen as a threat." The room was silent, save for the faint scribbling of reporters' pens. Marcus looked each council member in the eye. "You have a choice today," he said. "You can continue to turn a blind eye to the patterns exposed by this investigation. You can dismiss them as isolated incidents, as misunderstandings, or you can confront the truth. You can choose to reform a system that has failed its citizens for far too long." He stepped back from the microphone, the silence deafening as he returned to his seat. The hearing stretched on for hours, with testimony from other residents, legal experts, and even officers willing to admit that the system was broken. Marcus sat through it all, his resolve unshaken. The verdict of change. It took weeks for the city council to issue its ruling, but when the announcement finally came, the city was ready. The police department was ordered to undergo a full independent audit. Policies around traffic stops and profiling were rewritten. Officers would be required to undergo rigorous ongoing training, not the shallow workshops of the past, but real, actionable education tied to measurable results. A civilian oversight board was created to hold officers accountable for misconduct. And Officer Carson? She resigned before the investigation could conclude, her career ending under the shadow of her actions. Marcus stood on his porch the night the reforms were announced, looking out at the quiet street he had fought so hard to reclaim. David joined him, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did it," David said softly. Marcus shook his head. "We did it. It wasn't just me. It was everyone who refused to look away." David nodded, his gaze drifting toward the streetlight that now felt brighter somehow. "What happens next?" he asked. Marcus turned to his son, his expression calm but determined. "We keep going. Change isn't a destination, son. It's a road we walk every day." David smiled faintly, and together, they stood in silence as the first stars began to flicker in the night sky. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But Marcus knew one thing for certain. This battle, this moment, had mattered, and no one could take that away.